I want to talk today about a stock that's come on my radar, and that's Applied Materials. This is a semiconductor company. So, Applied Materials is a company that sells equipment, software, and services to semiconductor companies. So, they help companies across the entire computer chip market to actually build their products. If you guys know anything about semiconductors and how they're manufactured, the process actually involves a lot of automation because there's billions of little pieces called transistors that make up a computer chip. Just to place those billions of pieces by hand with a human being would take many, many, many years. So now, essentially what creates these semiconductors and designs them is what you call automated design tools. And that's part of some of the stuff that Applied Materials creates. So they have sort of a monopoly on the semiconductor industry. So they have equipment, software, and just specialized knowledge that nobody else has. They've been in the semiconductor space for a very long time now. So the company was actually founded in 1967. So they really have been there since the start of this industry. The company's involved in a wide variety of areas other than just manufacturing computer chips, right? They're actually involved in helping to manufacture solar panels, screen displays, all sorts of other things that just outside of just the basic computer chips that you would imagine.
The war for AI leadership in big data is really the biggest battle of our lifetime. If you look at what we're seeing today for our business, data generation, all of the smart devices in the world, the amount of data that needs to be stored, the processing of that data, the communication with 5G, all of those things were really in the top of the first inning.
Do people realize how much more silicon there is in voice than in their PC?
Well, there's 30 chips in your voice assistant. When you're talking to your voice assistant at home, there are 30 chips in that device. And again, you have to process that information. You have to store that information. So you have OLED displays, you have image sensors, you have applications processors, you have communication chips, you have memory to store all of that information. So ever since this device came out with billions of users, very pervasive, our business has been going continually up since 2010. So if you go forward in the future, transportation is going to change, healthcare, all of these, every part of our lives, Jim, are going to change in fundamental ways that nobody can even understand today. And that's worth trillions of dollars. I've seen estimates, $10 trillion of economic value.
The reason that this company has come up on my radar is because the semiconductor industry has been hit really hard ever since the trade wars, and we saw that the Chinese were actually hacking some of these computer chips by embedding small little pieces into their computer chips. A lot of the worries that if things continually go south with these trade wars, that these companies that do business in a lot of these different markets are going to get impacted. And I think the good thing is that they do a lot of the manufacturing at home, and the other manufacturing that they do is distributed across all sorts of different countries. So you have some in Israel, you have some in China, in Korea, a lot of all these different areas that they have manufacturing within. A lot of their demand comes from Asia. Most of it actually comes from South Korea, believe it or not. The majority of their demand comes from Samsung, who is about 25% of the company's demand. A lot of their sales do come from overseas, and that's kind of the worries. So semi companies have been hit really hard. Applied Materials, no exception. Like I said, the stock's down 40%. Let's dive deep into the numbers and look at whether or not some of this is justified, where the company stands today, what our viewpoint is on the future. So over the past 5 years, the company did $42 billion in sales, and that's been growing on average at about 18% year over year. So that's just a simple average that we calculated. So during that same period of time, the industry as a whole, the semiconductor industry, has been growing by about 8% on average. So they've been outperforming the industry, and the great thing is that this is a play on the overall semiconductor industry because they're not, in one specific area or the other. Really, the whole semiconductor industry interacts with Applied Materials. So this is a really great play to take a broad view on a rebound in semiconductors. So in 2017, this last year, the company's revenue was $14 billion, which was a 34% increase from the prior year. And during that same year, the industry only grew by 21%. So not only did they outperform the industry as a whole over the 5-year period, but even just last year, we saw the same thing. So they're operating at a very efficient level, growing very quickly. And overall, that growth is pretty tremendous. Considering some of the other areas in the economy and how well they're performing. Semiconductors has been one of the best overall performing industries over the last couple of years. And part of the reason is because of so much growth in artificial intelligence and, with things like blockchain, all these other new inventions that are coming out that require a lot of computer processing power. and a lot more complicated computer chips and semiconductors. So that's part of the reason that the industry is seeing so much growth, even though computer sales are starting to slow down. And even we're seeing that phone sales are starting to slow down. But I think a lot of the stuff with self-driving cars and some of this other stuff is going to really keep the semiconductor industry at a level of sufficient growth for years to come. So like I said, the biggest concern right now is international trade relations, what's happening with China. A company that's very similar to what Applied Materials does, Lam Research, just recently reported earnings, in October, about a week ago, and what we saw is that they actually cited that their Chinese growth was still relatively strong. They saw a lot of demand still from Chinese buyers, and essentially what that shows is that something like semiconductors is something that they can't afford to stop importing into their country, right? Because semiconductors in the U.S. are far superior, at least the semiconductor technology is a little bit far superior to what they have in China. And so that's one of the areas that they need to, they really need U.S. semiconductors. And so I don't think that you're going to necessarily see a huge slowdown with Chinese demand. So like I said, over the last 5 years, they did $42 billion in sales. They had a $7 billion profit. And right now, the total value of the company is $33 billion. So I think that the numbers are pretty decent considering their growth rate. And, when we look at the amount of assets that they own, it builds a pretty good picture for Applied Materials. I think right now it could really be undervalued. I think that, I'm going to start to consider taking some exposure into this position. It's just an overall play on the semiconductor industry. Like I said, it gives you a really good way of playing the overall industry in a company that operates very efficiently. So overall, I'm not making it a huge percent of my portfolio. I'm still keeping the exposure pretty small. And as the idea starts to shape up and maybe get more attractive, I'll think about adding more exposure for now, just overall. I think the idea is relatively solid. So for me, my timeline in this is probably just a few months, probably going into the end of the year. I'm not really big on right now taking a long-term investment. I don't know as much about this company as I would like. So I like the management. Their CEO right now, Gary Dickerson, has a lot of experience, in a lot of different areas. He worked at AT&T, GM, and then he was the CEO of another semiconductor company before becoming the CEO of Applied Materials. So he's got the experience, and really so far he's done a great job of running his company. So I don't think I'm really worried about the management. The numbers look really good, and their prospects for growth. Even though I think a big concern is slowdown in smartphone sales. Like I said, their biggest buyer is Samsung. So Samsung obviously putting these computer chips in their phones. So it's one of those areas that if phone sales start to slow down tremendously, that could have an impact on Applied Materials. But I think some of these other things like self-driving cars and all these other areas of the market will start to pick up some of that slack, right? And so overall, this could be a really good idea. And you could probably diversify a little bit in the semiconductor space as a whole, and maybe even play an ETF is kind of what I'm looking at potentially doing. So, it's not just about Applied Materials, it's also about the semiconductor industry as a whole. Anyways, guys, Warren Buffett out. Like I said, best words that have been spoken since Jesus. So yeah, shout out to me. Yeah, later.